Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth day of Research and Innovation Week. My name is Tony Almaguer, and I'm a Senior Director with the Office of Research. On behalf of the Office of Research, I'd like to thank you all for choosing to be here with us this afternoon. And this afternoon, I think you'll enjoy hearing Liz Scarpelli and Andrew Cullison's conversation about ethics and equity in academic publishing. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Andrew Cullison, the Director of UC Ethics Center, and he'll start with the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Margot, and thank you all for being here. It's been a fun day so far, and I've been really looking forward to this session. Before we get started, just a couple of things. There's one more session today as part of Ethics Day. It's the Hutton Lecture, Confronting the Global Knowledge Production Crisis in Healthcare. You can scan that QR code. We'll also post the link to the chat. And also what I'd like to do is down at the bottom, there's a little reaction smiley face. I want to make sure everybody knows how to use that in case you want to raise your virtual hand. And a way to test that you know how to use that is push it. And then Tony and Margot have been working really hard to pull this whole Research and Innovation Week off. I saw some great sessions this week. And so if we could just give them a little virtual round of applause, I'm going to do the little ta-da horn with confetti thingy. Tony and Margot, thank you so much. And without further ado, we'll get to this session a little bit on the topic. The topic for Research and Innovation Week, or the theme, is confronting crisis. So we tried to have some sessions that fit with that theme. And I thought one interesting kind of crisis when it comes to solving the world's problems has to do with how we gather and share our information. And I thought the UC Press is actually doing some pretty interesting things, particularly as it relates to open access. And I think there are interesting ethical issues when it comes to thinking about our publishing practices. And so it seemed like a good idea to do something on the ethics of and equity in academic publishing. So I invited Liz to join to lead a session here. And in our conversations, I myself am also interested in some of this stuff in my research. And Liz and I at some point said, well, maybe it should be more of a conversation where we both share some thoughts on some topics, but also take time to interact with the audience a little bit more and get some of your thoughts on some of the topics. So we've got a couple of topics on the ethics of and equity in academic publishing. But before we get started, I want to introduce Liz, Director of UC Press. Liz, you want to tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to come here?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to Research and Innovation Week. I'm delighted to be here again. This, I think, is my second presentation that I've done, and we've always had an author that's participated, so it's nice to be back and be able to talk to everyone. I first started in publishing after college. I've had 35 years of publishing experience so far, but I started as a textbook sales and marketing assistant, went into the field and sold textbooks for 10 years almost, dealing with mostly small colleges. And then eventually, after I took a sabbatical of 10 years to raise my children, I went into academic publishing and scholarly publishing. And that's where I've spent the vast part of my career, at Rutgers University Press, at Cambridge University Press. I did a stint in wholesaling with Baker and Taylor, which deals largely with the academic library market. And then I came to Cincinnati to start a brand new press, which was honestly, kind of a pinnacle of my career, getting to start with a blank slate and trying to answer the question of why do we need 145th University Press. So I really like to consider myself well-rounded when it comes to academic publishing and being on many sides of the table, so to speak.
Great. Well, the first issue that Liz and I wanted to talk with you all about has to do with the kind of resurgent interest in open access publishing. And for those who might not be familiar with the term open access, means that it's a resource that would be open and freely available to folks, as opposed to being something that you'd have to be required to pay for to get access to. And there are a lot of ethical issues in publishing that drove the interest in this, what you might call the open access movement. And what's interesting to me about UC Press is very much interested in this idea of open access publishing. So I thought we'd start there when we think about ethical issues. And so Liz, I was going to ask you, what are some of the ethical issues, what are some of the ethical issues in publishing that drove interest in what we might call the open access movement?
So open access was something that everyone would talk about as an academic publisher up until about 7 or 8 years ago, as this aspirational thing that didn't have a business model, that didn't really have a sustainable model with which to investigate. And so being at Rutgers University Press at that particular time, where you barely are making ends meet in terms of the revenue you're generating, it seems impossible to think about open access publishing. But when I came here to Cincinnati, as I said, I had this blank canvas. And so I was able to really collaborate with our dean of the library, Dean Wang, and he and I had a shared vision of not doing the same thing. He loves to call it disruptive publishing, and at times I believe we are disruptive. I like to call it stretching the boundaries of traditional publishing, but it was a way for us to explore things that we always had to say no to in traditional publishing, whether it was adding resources into a traditional book, adding research that the author had done that didn't quite fit into the narrative, accessible textbooks or accessible monographs, things that were available to individuals that had accessibility challenges, getting the content out to more than the 100 or so academic libraries that would purchase the books at the prices that we had to price them at. So open access represented a format for me that really allowed us to do different things and as I said, stretch those boundaries. And I will say that as somebody that really follows the open access market pretty closely, we do some different things that many of our peer publishers don't do in open access. A lot of people simply take the textbook or the monograph or the scholarly work and they make an open access version of it, meaning they just open up a PDF or they open an ebook, as you said, that doesn't have a boundary or an obstacle to in terms of finances. But we actually add other things in. So our version of open access is a little different. And it's interesting to me. I mean, I like business development. I like to create new things. It's kind of what I do. And so it has been really exciting to create a new style of publishing. And I think my team, who I am thankful for every single day, because I couldn't do what I do without the team of people that we have. It's what keeps me interested in where academic publishing can go, where scholarly publishing can go. Andrew, when we first talked about it, you had some really interesting thoughts about open access. In particular, you had mentioned a phrase to me about a broken market that I found really fascinating, being someone that is interested in economics. But how did you get interested in open access and just the idea of this as a different version of publishing?
Well, I'll tell you, but I want to note something interesting. When you noted an ethical issue with open access that had to do with equity for researchers. It sort of seemed like the private model of publishing or
Right.
creates a paywall, and there's a kind of inequity issue from people who are trying to get things published that might not be quote unquote marketable or might not sell as well or something like that. So that
Yeah.
was an interesting angle that I hadn't thought of. What got me there was on the student side. So as a professor, I've been a philosophy professor, an ethics professor for over 20 years. And something that always frustrated me about academic publishing is that it's this concept of a broken market. So a broken market, in theory, if you're a free market person, right? In theory, the way things are supposed to work is if somebody's pricing their product too high, some competitor will come in and underprice them, and then that keeps prices down. But there are sometimes you have a market where there's no corrective feature like that, and we call those broken markets. And the academic publishing industry is a broken market in the sense that if an academic publisher charges too much for a ethics textbook, my students can't say, you know what, Professor Cullison, that's priced too high. I'm going to go buy this cheaper ethics textbook that seems to have the same content and seems to be just about as good. They can't do that. They can't take the course. And so the people who are deciding what products are offered or available, the consumers of those products don't have that market power that you would have in a free market. So that's why it's kind of a broken market. And that's what I didn't like. I found that that always made me queasy as a professor. And so I actually, I tried to, within the bounds of fair use, create textbooks or readers where students either didn't have to pay at all or they have to pay a very, very low cost for it. So that's what, and then it's got me thinking about my own scholarship and whether I ought to publish in open access. So that's really kind of what got me into it. And so,
So
yeah, go ahead.
can I touch on something that you just said?
Yeah.
And that's the whole idea of pricing. One of the things that I think people don't realize, kind of the nuts and bolts, the business side of it, right? I mean, the cost of publishing has to come from somewhere. Publishing books is very expensive. People always think that, for instance, well, if publishers didn't publish in paper or hardback, then it would be much, much cheaper. And Amazon has not been a friend to us when it comes to that. I mean, everybody's love-hate relationship is with Amazon, frankly, because we can't live without them. They've opened our catalogs up to so many people that would never know who we are. Yet on the other hand, they discount everything to a point in time and require us to discount everything, that it becomes impossible for us to actually turn a profit. Fortunately, in scholarly publishing and university press publishing, the mission is not to turn a profit. The mission is actually to disseminate good, rigorous scholarship. And you're actually supposed to, in many instances, turn a blind eye to the bottom line, because you shouldn't be influenced by the bottom line. You should be influenced by the peer reviewers and all of that. But the P&L statement tells a different story, right? I mean, so the money has to come from somewhere, and printing is only 15%, maybe 20% of your model. But there's distribution costs, there's author and manuscript development costs, there's marketing costs, there's production costs. Everybody wants to get a royalty. And so there are so many pressures on that budget. And so when you talk about open access publishing, in a lot of ways, open access publishing was born out of a strategy, a business strategy for publishers to shift the cost from the libraries, whose budgets have been flat for years or are going down. Actually, if you consider inflationary costs, budgets are going down. And in fact, they had to come up with a different strategy. Where are they going to get their revenue from? So many journals started to do open access publishing, open access gold, open access green. And basically what they were saying is, okay, authors, if you want to publish with us, you have to pay to play. And many of those published journals started out as predatory journals, but then some of the other publishing, large publishers like Springer, Elsevier, started to get familiar with and use that model that generated revenue. We're not getting as many subscriptions. Okay, well, if we get a small amount of money from every author, our APC charges, that will pay for the content. Similarly, you're talking about textbooks and the price of textbooks. It used to be about the content, what the author pedagogically put into that book that was so important. For many faculty that still talk to representatives, the conversation is now about the platform, the analytics, the behavior of the students, what's actually available. Can I get my homework done through the gradebook software? Does it plug into Canvas? You know, when I was a sales rep back in the 80s and 90s, that we had supplements, you know, you couldn't imagine how many supplements we had, but we didn't really have a platform. It was, oh, you need a test guide, you need, you know, flashcards, you need a study guide, you need videos, you need this, you need that. And all of that stuff was free. That stuff is part of the budget. And so we would have these costs for textbooks, but we would get 1 year's worth of textbook costs. And then used books came into effect, sharing of books. People don't want to buy books. And so we had to figure out ways to compensate for that. And so we would go into new revisions, 3-year revision cycle, 2-year revision cycle. Now they've shifted the value of the content, not so important anymore. Now what's important are those platforms. And that's, again, overburdening, frankly, the students. So, you know, prices of textbooks are coming down with these inclusive access models, which is great, but every student has to buy that platform. Can't hand your homework in without that platform. No more sharing books, no more using used books. Every semester, new business for the publishers. So in a lot of instances, they have shifted the model of where that revenue for them is coming in. And to some extent, like I said, you can't do without the revenue because you can't publish without it. But the question is, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, there seems to be a little bit of a dark side with open access publishing. In fact, there's a question in the chat and a comment related to this. Ashley asks, are there funds at UC to pay for those kinds of open access fees for healthcare journal publishing? Goes on to say, if you were a junior faculty with limited funds, for example, one journal she's submitting to, the cost is $3,000 if accepted. And students certainly don't have that kind of money. So it's a huge issue for PhD students. Are there funds at UC for that kind of?
There are funds. This is something new. And the University Press, the University of Cincinnati Press, and the library are doing 2 different, thank you, Ashley, I'm glad you said that. We are running 2 different programs that all fall under the University Press responsibilities through a strategic sizing grant that we received from the Provost's office last year. And so I can, if the people that are in charge of this webinar are interested, I can share my screen really quickly and show you how you can find out about that. Is that okay, Andy?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, and we can switch to the next topic after that.
Okay, so I will, give me a second to pull that up because that was on a slide that I can access really quickly. But basically, let me just talk to you first about it. There is a grant opportunity that we have at the press. Essentially, what you can do is you can apply for a grant to cover up to $4,000 of your APC costs. And that is assuming you do not have grant funding to cover those APC costs or publishing funding somewhere else. I will show you in a moment exactly where you can find that grant funding. But in addition to that, there are agreements and waivers that the library has available. And again, this is all on the website that I will show you. But for instance, we have free open access publishing with Cambridge University Press due to the subscriptions that we have through OhioLink, which is a very important part of Ohio library collection and acquiring resources. So you can essentially publish in any Cambridge University Press journal for free without an APC cost, as long as you are publishing with them. Also, Wiley has provided a large number of their journals. Again, same situation, because we have a wonderful set of collections and agreement with them. We have negotiated to get waivers for the APC costs for Wiley. And I do know Wiley has a lot of STEM publications, so I think you'll find something there. Finally, we also have 8 waivers from Igi Global Publishing. So this is something that's going to continue. Our librarians are getting more and more educated and more knowledgeable on the opportunities that are available from credible publishers that are combined subscription and publishing contracts. It's more or less called read to publish kinds of contracts. And they will sometimes supply these waivers, fees. And then if you want to publish in a journal, like I said, that isn't part of Wiley, Cambridge, or IGI, then you can simply apply for a grant from the University of Cincinnati Press, and we will help you out with those charges as well.
Liz, it looks like someone already posted the link in the chat. So got you covered there. Yeah.
Yes, they did.
Yep. So got you covered.
Thank you to our GNP librarian, Amy Koschhofer.
And Greg notes in the chat that bargaining unit faculty might have faculty development funds that would provide sources of funding for this as well.
I will say, and that is very true, what I have been told by some of our faculty is that educators often do not have professional development funds for publishing. And I will also say that I believe it's a little, there's an imbalance between the humanities faculty and some of the STEM faculty that have grant funding available. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that there's maybe not equal pots, but that there is a pot of money that everybody, regardless of what their status is, so whether they're a graduate student, a educator, or a tenure track faculty member, or whether they're in humanities, social sciences, or STEM, that there is grant funding available for all of us.
Right. Liz, I'd like to turn to the topic of equity and inclusion. We already sort of touched on how open access, at least one of the benefits of open access is there might be viewpoints or topics that aren't as popular to publish, but are important, particularly as they relate to issues of equity and inclusion. So there's a way in which traditional publishing could be exclusionary. I'm wondering, what are some other issues related to equity and inclusion in academic publishing? What kinds of issues, as a director of an academic press, do you face? And what are university presses, or how can university presses advance equity and inclusion related goals?
Good question. I refer typically to DE&I plus A, which I know I've heard various groups at UC talking about the plus A, plus accessibility. And we do take that very seriously at our press. It is expensive to add accessibility into the mix. So you're already talking about, and again, I hate to talk about business and numbers all the time, but somebody's got to pay all those costs, and creating accessible works adds a layer of cost to many to the books that many publishers can't afford. But you know, there are some really interesting things that open access allows us to do. For one, it gives access to everyone. So you don't have that financial barrier to accessing scholarly content. You know, people can access the scholarly content that is published in open access from anywhere, on the internet, on their mobile phone. They can simply just connect and read whatever it is, download whatever they need in most instances. In particular, AUPress is a mission of social justice. So we are really very sensitive to the idea of thinking that access of this scholarly content should be available to as many people as possible. That also goes along with what President Pinto has said so many times in his strategic plan about faculty creating an impact. And so it shouldn't just be faculty writing monographs for other faculty or journal articles for other scholars, but opening up that knowledge and opening up that dialogue to people outside of the ivory tower, outside of academia, to our practitioners in the field, to the people that are actually being written about. You know, frankly, many anthropology works are not accessible to the people that they are writing about. And so open access allows those communities of people to be able to read and utilize the content, frankly. Open access also allows us to diversify the voices. So I'll just give you an example because it's one that we use every day. We have an open access platform called Manifold that we have put all of our open access content on. That not only allows our authors to publish in an open access format, but it also allows for annotations on the platform. So a reader who's reading that content can highlight any piece of content that's on the platform, and they can write an annotation or a comment about it. And it becomes a thread, a conversation, if you will, between different readers, between back to the author again. So I often have, we have a book by Rebecca Wingo on digital community engagement, which is about digital scholarly galleries and platforms and different ways of providing content. We have often had readers and users of that book come in and write a comment, and then Rebecca will come in because she gets a notification that somebody's commented on her book, and she will come back and there's a dialogue all of a sudden between that author and that reader. That never happens with a traditional book that's printed or even an ebook. That can only happen in an open access environment. And finally, the other way that university presses are really trying to be thoughtful about how they publish their books is that we want to make sure that not only the staff is diversified, and I'll be the first to say that university presses for a very long time did not do a great job of diversifying their presses. People of color were, you know, virtually absent from the publishing world. Over the last 10 years, the university press community has had a concerted effort to introduce people of color to the publishing world and provide mentoring programs. There's a wonderful fellowship program that they run that is funded by the Mellon Foundation. But there are other things that we have started doing. We have started trying to get different people from the production end representing either the authors or the content. So if the authors of the book are people of color, we should have people producing the book that also represent those persons of color. If the content is about an indigenous community, can we find a designer or a copy editor that has an indigenous background? That is so important to understanding the voice and the perspective of what goes into the content. And I have to say, for one time, I can say a small staff is a blessing, because there's really just two of us. There's my absolutely spectacular managing editor, Sarah Muncy, and we're the only two at the press besides our army of interns. And so we don't have the luxury of having a production department. So what we do is we have a great pool of freelancers. And because we utilize freelancers so much, we make sure that we have people of color and Indigenous groups as part of our freelance production department, so that we can call on those people to participate, whether it is in a project that is based on a topic of interest to a certain community, or just to bring those different voices in and those different perspectives in, regardless of what the content is. We also do that with peer review. We make sure that the peer review represents the audience, represents the author, represents the topic. It's not just about finding a history professor in a particular area of history. It's about finding those different backgrounds that provide a richer report, frankly, and read with different lenses than we would have normally seen. So we are trying all different ways to diversify the content at the University of Cincinnati Press. And I will say many of my counterparts at other presses are doing similar things.
Great. I posted a comment in the chat. We want to hear from you. So I have 3 focus questions: thoughts about pros or cons of open access, thoughts about inequity in academic publishing, any experiences as students or researcher in academic publishing that are frustrating that open access may or may not address. Raise your virtual hand. This is a small enough group. You could just unmute yourself or type something in the chat. And there's Tony. All right, Tony. So the theme of Research and Innovation Week is confronting crisis. What is one crisis the University of Cincinnati Press is confronting? What resources are you using or required in order to tackle that crisis?
Wow. I don't know if we have enough time left in the week to answer those questions, but I'll take a stab at it. So probably the 2 crises we have right now, there's the practical one. We're 2 people trying to publish 12 books a year, 7 journals a year, and we're launching a new imprint in affordable textbooks. So open educational resources. So that's the practical. How does that get done with 2 full-time people and an army of interns? But the more interesting question is the question of sustainability, probably. And how does a press whose mission is to create affordable textbooks, open access opportunities, diversify the scholarly dissemination of knowledge, how do we make that sustainable when revenue is not at the forefront of that conversation? How do we bring those less heard voices out if we're constantly worried about the bottom line? And so that is a question that's challenging, is how are we going to continue the press mission of publishing in open access, which in and of itself is not a sustainable model, right? I mean, somebody's got to pay the bills to keep the electric on. So that is a question.
Other thoughts, questions, comments?
So Andy, let me ask you, in terms of bringing in DE&I to publishing as a philosophy scholar, what is an idea that you think to yourself perhaps publishers haven't thought of? And I'm sure there's a lot, frankly, but how do you propose that we continue to create equity within academic publishing?
Well, that's a good question. I can't say blanket all publishers have not thought of this kind of thing, right? But I can say that when we raise questions of equity, sometimes different people have different ideas as to what that means. And so when we think about equity in publishing, it would be good to kind of get clarity about what that even means. So for example, in my experience, sometimes people equate equity with equality, for example. So they just say, oh, so if you really want equity, it means everybody gets the same thing, right? Because
Right.
isn't that what equity is? It's equal. And there's a really good image, and I think I heard that image originated from someone here in Cincinnati of three people at a like a baseball game or something, right? And it's there's like three boxes, and there's a really short kid, like a teenager, and an adult. They're all standing on the box. They each get a box, and the shortest kid, he's staring at the fence. He can't see over the fence, right? But then they're like, that's equal, right? And then equity is the shortest kid, he gets two boxes so that he can see over. The teenager gets one box so that he can see over, and the adult didn't need a box. They were tall enough anyway. They didn't stand on the box. They can see over the fence anyway. Does that make sense? And they say that's equity, right? So equity is everybody getting what they need to thrive, or whatever the goal is. Everybody getting what they need to achieve what the shared goal is, something along those lines. Now, I don't because I'm not in the publishing industry. I don't know how that translates out, but when conversations of equity arise, I think it's important to note that there's a view about equity that I'm sympathetic to, that it means sometimes you get uneven distributions of goods, right? It doesn't necessarily have to mean everyone gets the exact same. Everyone gets one cookie or everyone gets $1, right? It's that it's okay to have some uneven distribution of resources to make sure that everyone's getting what they need. So, and I don't know, I think that's a nuance in the talk about equity that I think can often get overlooked.
Well, I think, and that brings it back to open access again, and that was one of the justifications, if you will, for APCs, because rather than the libraries paying for higher subscription rates, why shouldn't the authors, who are the ones that are getting the benefit of publishing in these academic journals, why shouldn't the authors and potentially the host institutions help to pay for that? There is a comparable scenario in book publishing as well, because as I said, we have 145 university presses. Of those, about 90 are in the United States. 90 universities publishing all of the academic, well, not all, but a large portion of the academic scholarly content by tenure track faculty is not sustainable, frankly, especially if there is no subsidy. So if all universities participated to some regard to support their authors when they went out to get a publishing contract, which is part of the process of RPT, then a sustainable model could be created that would allow university presses to function as a facilitator of that RPT process. But right now you have 90 universities footing the bill for all of those scholars that are trying to get their tenure book published. So, it is challenging. And then you complicate it with, well, we're not really supposed to look at the numbers, which is impractical, frankly.
Ashley notes, in my experience, most people with the most money and the most NIH grants are the ones who get to publish open access. It does benefit everyone when everyone can see the article, but then the inequity just moves up toward the scholars as opposed to the readers. I think that's a really good and interesting point, Ashley.
It is. And I agree. I mean, if you think of the HBSUs or colleges that are in less affluent areas, smaller colleges, there are many, many faculty that don't have the opportunity nor the funding to cover the APC costs. And so this is a crisis, frankly, because there isn't a sustainable model out there to perpetuate scholarly dissemination. Open access is wonderful, but Ashley is not wrong in saying that it's being pushed back onto the scholars. Frankly, there does have to be a discussion amongst administrators at higher education institutions and libraries and publishers to work on a collaborative model that allows for that knowledge to get out there and for a greater diversity of voices, because it is right now, it is swinging toward certain groups of people, certain groups of scholars, certain groups of demographics, frankly.
And, you know, it's an interesting, not only, I'm really fascinated when solutions to ethical problems just rear their ugly head elsewhere in the chain. I'm kind of obsessed with those kinds of puzzles, and you're highlighting one right here. And there might even be more places where the mole head pops up elsewhere. So there's pushing it onto the scholars, but if you're saving libraries money by making the authors pay, and the authors turn around and ask their colleges to pay, I don't know much about high-level university budgets, but you could end up in scenarios where, I mean, there are some places where the libraries have more money than some of the departments or the colleges, at least in their budget for certain kinds of things. So you could be theoretically pushing the cost off to a less well-funded area, and that may not be true at UC, but I know it could be true at some small colleges. Also, Greg mentioned that if you're bargaining faculty, which means you're represented by the union, you might have access to those funds, but you might not if you are visiting or adjunct trying to get your way into a more permanent position, something along those lines. And publishing is more important when you're trying to secure a position and prove to an institution that you're doing research and teaching that's something they would value. All right.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, depending upon who you're publishing with, oftentimes there's something in contracts called right of first refusal, which means once you publish with a publishing company once, you are obligated to give them your manuscript or your articles in the future before you go somewhere else. And that publisher has the right to turn it away or publish it, even if it's not the best choice for you, or you didn't have the best experience the first time around. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's a important negotiating point, but is it ethical to force that junior scholar to, make a decision that's going to impact them for the next 40, 50 years of their professional career? I'm not so sure about that.
Right. Liz, Andrea has an interesting comment that it's more about the history or the origins of university presses that I thought I want to put to you. Andrea says, I thought that was why scholarly presses were founded in the first place. That is, the university is supposed to foot the bill to disseminate academic ideas out in the wider world and to protect academic freedom. Do you have thoughts on that comment?
I do, and I also need to dispel Andrea's thought. There are actually no fully supported university presses in the world, let alone in our country. There are a number of university presses that have to survive on their own revenue or their own endowment if they're lucky enough to have one. So endowments would be, examples would be Stanford, for instance, MIT Press, for instance. But the vast majority of university presses get a very small subsidy from their university, maybe in the neighborhood of somewhere between 10 and 30% of their operating costs. And then everything else comes from revenue and or what we call book subsidies, which is essentially that the author comes up with funding somewhere, whether it's through a grant or research funds or someplace else. So there are, and that includes University of Cincinnati. We are not funded by the university either. So our funding comes from carryover funds. Our funding comes from sharing in-kind staff with the library, and very little funding comes from the university anymore. So that is unfortunately untrue. And again, it's not only is it not a sustainable model, it again makes you wonder how people are making decisions based on a mission when they have to make sure that they have enough money to pay people's salaries.
John McNay makes an interesting point. Thank you, John. Says that higher education and what we do is a public good is something that gets lost in these financial conversations. When it all boils down to money, the public good gets left behind. Our universities are choosing to spend money on some things and not others. John, I'm sympathetic to your point that the public good sometimes gets lost, that we're supposed to be advancing public good. I'm a Jeffersonian in my belief that the point of higher education has to do with sustaining our democracy. That's the root core of why he obsessed over it. So thank you for that. We have about 12 minutes left. I just want to, when I'm involved in presentations, I just like to put a little cap on things. And then Liz, I want to turn it over to you and ask you a few questions about UC Press. So I gather that what we've discussed today is that, you know, open access arose out of equity concerns, both from the idea that, you know, there was inequity in what gets published and what doesn't get published. And so open access is a boon to researchers who might otherwise not get their voices to be heard. It promises to be a benefit to students because of that whole broken market concept. But like you whack-a-mole here, it pops up here. There's some messiness to whether or not open access solves all those solutions. Because like you said, it's got to get paid for somehow. And where we shift costs away from students and from libraries, we may be unduly shifting them elsewhere. And so that's a kind of call to sort of keep an eye out for when we seek these innovative solutions, make sure we're not we solve one problem, but create another. And to that end, this is Research and Innovation Week. And one of the things that stood out to me about University Press is University of Cincinnati Press, rather, is exploring some innovative ways to serve UC faculty and students. And Liz, I thought we could sort of wrap up by could you share with us some of the opportunities that faculty, researchers, and students have to get involved with UC Press and some of the things you're working on?
Sure, I would love to. And I can use this as, you know, my little PSA, certainly. But it's also a, you know, take it with also the understanding that when you are an author and a scholar, that you should feel comfortable shopping around. And not every publisher does everything quite the same way. There are, you know, everybody certainly is trying to publish a book that is cutting edge scholarship or by somebody with a platform. Everybody is looking to have critical mass in certain areas. So for us, our area is, for instance, social justice, community engagement and partnerships, education studies, DEI and A studies, and regional studies, meaning tri-state, greater Ohio studies. And you really, when you have a manuscript, you should be looking at what your goals are. If your goals are to make money on your publication, then you want to look for a place that has great marketing, and you want to look for a place that has a big book bag. If your goal is to really have an intimate discussion about your manuscript and development, then you want to have a relationship with that editor and that production person. And there are some presses that are better than others at that. I will say that's where we shine. Our services are very niche, very boutique, very individualized to the book. And so, you know, if that's what you're looking for, then you should get it. Some publishers have platforms that allow for open access publishing, and it's part of their model. We happen to be a publisher that publishes in traditional print and ebooks. And then we also offer open access opportunities, and we have the publishing platforms to support that. We have a journal, an installation of open journal system, so we can publish open access journals. We have an installation of Manifold, which allows us to publish open access books and embed resources right into the book itself that couldn't be hosted at Manifold, or they could be hosted anywhere else, whether it be a YouTube platform. We have a book by Jeff Blevins that just came out, Jeff Blevins and James Lee, for instance, on social media, and it links to the Digital Scholarship Center's servers, because you can take the information and the data sets that are in that book and that book was written about, and you can manipulate them. So you can, if you want to see, you know, in a traditional book, you would have an image and then a lot of narrative that would explain it. But maybe you don't want to see an image that highlights what the authors were talking about. In this particular instance, one of the case studies is how Black Lives Matter came to be the hashtag that everybody remembers in the Ferguson incident. Maybe you want to look at what happened on March 4th or March 23rd or 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 36 hours after the killing of George Floyd or Michael Brown. And so you can manipulate that data because we provide that link into the digital scholarships material. There are data visualizations that talk a person through how to actually do that kind of work on your own. You can't have that in a regular book. So if that's what you're interested in, and having your research literally delivered to the reader, then you want to look for a press that experiments in open access like we do, that has those platforms that are going to support that kind of work and expertise in that publisher. And I would say there's about 10 publishers that do that, UC being one of them. So you want to consider that. You know, we're now dipping our toe in the water in open access for students. So open educational resources. We're not competing with the bookstore and Follett. We think inclusive access is great, and it's doing a great job of bringing costs down on the textbook. Again, I think you have to be careful as an adopter of how much that platform is costing. And if you're using that inclusive access platform, you're eliminating the possibility of that student using a used book or a rented, well, not a rented book, but a used book, or or sharing a book. Or if they drop out of the class 3 weeks later, they don't get their money back. They can't sell that book to somebody else. That book was theirs, whatever they paid for it, and that platform is theirs, even though they're not using it anymore. So I think you have to think through all of that. And our contribution to the textbook affordability is that we are now creating open educational resources for faculty that are interested in providing what we call zero cost courses. So Z courses is what a lot of schools are calling it. And that means that there's no cost to the student whatsoever to take that course. There's no textbook cost, there's no platform cost. It's just their tuition dollars to be there. And so we do have that model, and we're actually incentivizing people or faculty to create or even just use open access resources that are already available. We're not even asking them necessarily to write their own, but we are providing professional development funds up to $4,000 to a faculty member that's interested in writing or remixing open educational resources. So I guess my message is really investigate what people are telling you, and don't just take it at the surface, because this is a very fast moving industry at the moment, which is kind of an oxymoron in and of itself to think of publishing as fast moving. But I do think it's fast moving, and there's a little bit of shell game going on, or 3-card Monte. I lived in New York for 50 years, and so I'm very familiar with the cardboard box and the 3 cards. But you do want to be educated about what your choices are for textbook adoption, what your options are for publishing, and where you can find some funding. And you can certainly find funding at UC Press. And we're very much a public service to the university. So don't feel that you can't come to us if you have a question about Routledge, if you have a question about Palgrave, if you have a question about University of Michigan Press. My job at the university includes advising you on other areas as well, whether or not it has any benefit to the UC Press. So, just know that about the services that we provide.
Thank you, Liz. This has been great. Thank you all for joining us. One more event today, the Hutton Lecture, Confronting the Global Crisis in Knowledge Production. We'll post links in the chat. Please feel free to also fill out a feedback form. We'd love to hear from you and get feedback on the events today. So Venus just posted the link to the Global Crisis in Knowledge Production, and we'll be posting the link to the feedback form as well. Thank you all. Again, Liz, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
And Tony and Margot, we're in the final stretch. Thank you both. Tony, I'm going to hand it over to you. Do you have anything else you want to say before we head out?
Just thank you all for attending this afternoon.